So I'm going to focus on where BME workers are based in Wales, the sorts of jobs that they do, and the level of inequality they face in terms of pay, how that links with discrimination and exclusion from the labour market as well, and then a brief bit about BME workers and trade unions. I just want to say a few things about this though. So it's data from other sources. So some of the language and the groupings that are used by some of the ways that stats are officially collected might not always be language that we're comfortable with, and that it's just data, it's just averages and stats, and you know, for lots of us I think it can feel like quite an establishment way to look at some of these issues. So it focuses on what's easy to measure, so things like pay, and not necessarily, you know, how things affect us emotionally. So I just want to kind of add those caveats in from the start. So this is a bit of a timeline of employment rate by ethnicity in Wales. It's very headline. It shows the gap between BAME workers and white workers in Wales and the employment rate for those two groups. And I think it doesn't show us a great deal, because I think a lot of the more kind of interesting, significant information sits underneath this data. But it does show that there's been a persistent gap between the employment rate for white workers and BAME workers in Wales so since the data has been recorded. And I think that gap is around sort of 10 percentage points, and it's not really narrowing either. This is a horrible chart, sorry. It's very difficult to get complex stuff like this looking nice. And this shows occupation by ethnicity. So it looks at particular groups of workers based on which occupation they sit in and their ethnic background. I've highlighted a couple of stats there because this is where we start to see how where people are in the labour market has a big impact on their pay and their risk of being in poverty. So it shows that black workers are a much higher chance of being in caring, leisure and other service activities. And then we see other groups of workers, so people from Indian and other Asian backgrounds, more likely to be in professional occupations, which again can have a big impact in terms of their likelihood of being in lower or higher pay. And then I think more relevant to our movement is which industries people fall in, because when we look at where people are more likely to be in a unionised work environment, that tends to be more down to which industry they're working in. And again, we see, you know, kind of industry gaps between different ethnic groups. So people from Asian, Indian and Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds are more likely to be working in transport and communication industries. And then people from a black background are more likely to be in public administration, education and health. So we see kind of gaps emerging like that, which I think is a good indicator for how likely somebody is to be in an industry with fairer work or not. This chart shows the different pay, the likelihood of being in a low pay role based on your ethnicity. So we know that there is a gender pay gap in the UK, and pay is obviously a key measure of work, of the quality of work. But I think this chart is more useful to consider than simply the kind of headline pay gap between white workers and BME workers, because I think it's that bit on towards the right of your screen where it shows the risk of being in the in lower pay that really gives us an idea of why BME workers and BME workers from certain backgrounds are more likely to be in much lower paid roles. So I think particularly Pakistani, Bangladeshi and black workers are at a far higher risk of being in low pay. And it's also clear that not all BME workers experience lower pay on average. So I think it's important to recognise that people from different BME backgrounds have very different experiences. And there's a bit of hope as well, because when this data is broken down by age group, there's a smaller pay gap for younger workers. And it's also interesting that once occupation and education are taken into account, so once people's formal qualification levels are considered, there's actually a much smaller gap between BME and white workers. However, that gap does remain quite wide when you consider if somebody was born in the UK or not. So once you start to look further and further into the data, you realise that actually it's incredible, like people's experiences based on their ethnicity and where they were born present a really, really complex picture about the experiences of BME workers in Wales. I just wanted to touch on intersectionality a bit, because that's something that we try to really take into account in lots of our equality work at the Wales TUC. And these two charts just show that women in almost all ethnic groups are at greater risk of lower pay. And lots of the research shows that there's like a compounding effect when it comes to discrimination. So particularly when you take into account things like ethnicity and disability together, somebody's risk of being in a poor quality job or from being excluded from the jobs market altogether are much, much greater. So we can't just look at one aspect of someone's characteristics in isolation without considering other risk factors as well. And it's not just about, I think, discrimination or inequality within the workplace. It's also about the fact that BME people are at greater risk of being unemployed. They're at greater risk of being in that category called economically inactive, which is a horrible term because people aren't inactive at all. They're just often not able, well, they don't even feel like they're able to look for work. So it indicates that there is a very high level of discrimination, I think, that's keeping a lot of people even out of the labour market, and we need to address that. And BME people are much greater risk of things that we all recognise as being really like bad quality employment or unfair practices. So TUC research on BME workers' experience has shown that they're twice as likely to be stuck on an agency contract, which comes with lots of issues around poor quality work. 1 in 13 are in temporary work, which compares to 1 in 19 white workers. And BME people are much more likely to be on a 0 hours contract as well. We're always interested in poor quality work and low pay and job insecurity in relation to poverty. And the data around and the research on poverty and BME communities in Wales is fairly limited, which is something that we'd be looking to address along with lots of other organisations who are present here today. But the research has shown that the link between ethnicity and the work that people from BME backgrounds do is absolutely critical in determining their risk of being in poverty. So just to touch quickly on ethnicity and trade union membership, again, these are national stats, so these are all classifications used by the ONS. I think it's a really complex story. So I think overall BME workers remain underrepresented in our movement. That's both in terms of membership, but also in terms of positions, whether it's voluntary positions or officer positions. I think lots and lots of work is happening within the movement to try and address that, and has been for many years. That's through things like setting up committees, through training programmes specifically to bring BME people up through both voluntary roles and the professional roles within the union. But I think there's still lots more that can be done. I think it's interesting that people born outside the UK are less likely to be a union member than somebody born in the UK. So there's clearly stuff that we need to do to reach out to people. And there's obviously that tension between what we do, which is around the collective voice of the workforce and trying to represent minority voices, that we always have to try to work through. And I think that's through having really active BME memberships and also making sure that our movement becomes as representative as it can be. Just to touch quickly on the work that we've been doing through the crisis. So we've recently published a guide on COVID-19 for BME workers. Obviously, we're all aware of the increased risk that many BME workers and BME people face in relation to the virus. And so this guide talks through some of the steps about how you can work safely and what you need to do if you don't feel like you can be safe at work. We've also published a survey as well, again, because we want to hear from as many BME workers as possible about their experiences of working through this crisis, how they felt they've been protected, what more can be done. And Wales TUC works in social partnership with Welsh Government and employers to use all the policy levers that we've got here in Wales to try to work through some of the challenges. And That includes the experience of BME workers through this crisis. So we've worked with government on things like a risk assessment for BME workers. But again, we want to hear from you to find out what more we can be doing. Thank you very much.